Hello and welcome to my channel about Al. My name is Al, actually Alexander.
Why wasn't Thailand colonized? Hard word. Yeah, this I hear a lot. Why it wasn't colonized? Because almost every country around you was colonized. I guess most were by the British people. Also, Vietnam, I guess, was France. And Spain also really big one. Yeah.
France.
So why Thailand? No one was interested to colonize Thailand, and now everyone will go to Thailand, tourist country number 1. So we will have a look. Let's go.
As the powers of Europe began to grow, expand throughout the of this expansion, over time, almost every non-European nation became a colony of one European nation or another at some point. Only
in Africa also a lot.
managed to escape becoming overpowered by the Europeans.
So red is Great Britain,
How
blue
did they
is
do it?
France.
For a nation like Thailand, which was surrounded by British, French, and Dutch territories,
Dutch
there
also,
seemed to be no hope of avoiding colonialism.
Yeah.
And yet, somehow, not the
Siam.
British, nor the French, or even the Dutch ever colonized Thailand, and neither did any other European power. So if Thailand was never subject to colonialism, how did it manage to pull that off?
Yeah. You know the answer already?
There
You
are
study
a
like
few
this in
reasons
school?
to explain why no one
Or
ever
not?
decided to colonize Thailand.
They gave, and then I turned.
Okay. So, but normally like in history class, you will learn like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or, at the time, the king. Firstly, the Brits and French in particular were actually a bit relieved to have these. With Britain now possessing Malaysia and Burma, and the French taking Indochina, the two European powerhouses had found themselves only separated by the land of Siam. Without it, both sides feared potential border disputes, and therefore were excessively hesitant to take the kingdom for themselves. The Netherlands had also entered the region when it colonized Indonesia, and although this buffer state wasn't necessarily needed for them, since it was not between Indonesia and the other colonies, the general state of peace that it could help maintain in the area was still a benefit for the Dutch. So, this established an immediate reason for Siam to remain uncolonized from the very start. But it wasn't the only factor.
Okay, so
Secondly,
one thing was that France and United Kingdom don't wanted to have bordered next to each other, because then could be they will start a fight. So they were like happy there is something between them, and France would not go to Thailand, Kingdom neither, because they don't want to have a big war against each other. So they say, okay, Thailand in the middle is okay. And what else?
Especially Chulalongkorn, to avoid colonization, they had to transform their political system into a more Europeanized version. This became a massive nation-building project that led to the modernization of today's Thailand. An important aspect of this project was map-making. The Siamese realized that the Europeans put a lot of emphasis on knowledge, especially topographical knowledge. The Europeans used maps to define territory that they ruled, and when borders were ill-defined, they used this as an opportunity to take the land. The concentration of power was important. In the Siamese mandala system, power wasn't well defined. Local rulers maintained a high level of autonomy in different regions, and that could have been a problem for the whole kingdom. After this problem was realized, a standing professional army was introduced. This showed the unity of the kingdom, and it gave the king more power to control the local rulers. The concentration of power became a beneficial advantage in the fight against Western colonization. Another important factor might be the transition to Europeanism. In Siam, The royal family set a fashion for admiring Western things. Cars and other European things were imported. Chulalongkorn enjoyed being photographed in Western clothes, and he sent his sons for European education. Still, there was a brief period of concern that may have led to a change of plans, if not for the eventual outcome. Counterintuitive.
So they decided to make the country more like a Europe standard. Like we write on a paper, our border is from there to there, Siam is from this point to this point, because the European people would just take the land if no one write there is a border. So like Europeans are famous for their paperwork. You need to have a paper for everything. So if you have a paper where it say this is my land, they will be like, okay, then not. And also they try to like dress more European, so they will not. I guess this was the problem with many other countries. Like they say, they didn't seem like, okay, you're not European, so we can take your land away because you don't need it anyway. Kind of like this. Okay, let's continue. What they say.
To the presence of Siam as a arrival of the European colonists, a war broke out between the French and Siamese. The Pak Nam incident that happened in 1893 can be seen as the culmination of this conflict. Previously, the French and Siamese had come to an agreement that allowed the French to pass freely all the way up to the Pak Nam Islands, and so they decided to do just that.
Then they're close to
Having
Bangkok.
already anchored a gunboat at the French embassy in Bangkok, France wanted to send a second gunboat and an aviso up the Chao Phraya River to meet with the first ship. For some reason, the Siamese decided that they no longer wished to permit free passage to the French in this instance, and instead forbade the French from continuing their journey. Unsure of what to do next, the French commander Captain Bory tried to await further instructions from Paris, but no such messages came. The French consul, Auguste Pavy, suggested that the ships anchor at Ko Si Chung temporarily, until they received proper advice as to how to continue. He informed Bory of the warning given by the Siamese and hopes that this would be enough to pause the journey and avoid any conflict. Bory, contrarily, was more focused on his need to move forward. Given that the next chunk of his voyage necessitated a high tide, Bory wanted to hurry along his way, regardless of what the Siamese wanted. And so, gaining support from Rear Admiral Edgar Heuman, Bory chose to go forward and ignore Pavy's advice. This, of course, did not sit well with the Siamese.
If they say no and they do it anyway.
To set on July the 13th, the French followed high tide and continued on their path toward the Pak Nam Islands. The French were unaware of the fact that the Siamese had already been prepared for their entry, having been waiting in their battle stations. At first, the Siamese would have been unable to see the French ships approaching due to heavy rain and low clouds. It wasn't until the rain had let up that night that the Siamese caught sight of the boats as they passed by a lighthouse. For now, there was no action taken. The French ships were not in range of the Siamese guns, and the former was obviously not intending to fight the latter first. But once the gap was closed, the Siamese shot off 2 blanks to see if the French would heed the warning. No response came, and the ships were still moving forward. So the Siamese now fired a real warning shot into the water. Still, the French ignored. Now, the Siamese fired one more live shot to trigger their gunboats to open fire. The French engaged, firing back with their own shots, which caused a wave of chaos to wash over the Siamese defenders, with both the fort and gunboats being commanded by newly arrived Danes who spoke not even a lick of Siamese. The ability of the
Andrea
Siamese
Duplessis
to
de
fire back
Richelieu.
was hindered. According to one witness, the Danish captains on the Siamese ships ended up having to run back and forth between the bridge and the guns, which they would have to fire themselves. The situation scarcely differed at the fort. Likely due to unorganization and lacking effort by the Siamese, the French were shortly able to pass through, mostly unscathed, and reach Pak Nam. This entire encounter angered the French, especially considering the fact that it was a violation of a prior agreement made by the two sides. The initial punishment given by the French was to establish a blockade of the river after the French ships had departed to head back home. This, unfortunately, had a significantly negative effect on British trade as well, which prompted the Brits to put pressure on both sides for negotiations. This was not the first time that the French and Siamese had clashed over political disputes, though. Since the arrival of the British and French, more and more pressure was put on Siam, and they started to lose some territories. Earlier on in the previous year, tensions had started to rise after the French government general of Indochina had sent Auguste Pavie to bring Laos under French authority. Other incidents,
so
such as
they
the
took
expulsion
Laos
of 3
easier.
French merchants by 2 different Siamese governors, also sparked an anti-Siamese sentiment back in France, which only encouraged the brewing friction. This would later prompt Pavie to demand that the Siamese evacuate every last military post that they had onto the east of the Mekong River, as he claims that this region truly belongs to Vietnam. As part of this pressure, Pavie sent what would be the first French gunboat anchored in Bangkok. Before that, though, in April, the French sent a military force into the disputed region to seize control. Eventually, the Siamese did agree to give Laos over to the French, which required a new treaty between France and Britain to establish clear borders between French Laos and Upper Myanmar, which was in British hands. It was significantly important for both sides to not only define these borders, but to also ensure that peace could be maintained with the Kingdom of Siam. It remains the case that a buffer territory would be ideal for the British and French colonies, as both sides were dealing with enough of their own problems within the surrounding lands to want to risk a war with each other. This alone could have stopped Thailand from being colonized. Subsequently, the Siamese started to pass sweeping economic, military, and administrative reforms. This created a new centralization process in Siam, which greatly pleased the West, and led to Britain and France reiterating their neutral stance and insisting they had no plans of occupying, colonizing, or in any other way taking over the territory of Siam. By 1910, a series of updated treaties had established the borders of modern-day Thailand. That same year, King Chulalongkorn died and was succeeded by his son, King Rama VI, who had been educated at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and the University of Oxford, which helped contribute to the leadership's westernization. New
then they
systems
couldn't
and schools were opened. The
anyway
Gregorian
anymore.
calendar was adopted, and even societal changes were encouraged in order to better match the West. Following a brief, failed palace revolt in which a group of young military officers attempted to overthrow the king in favor of a more westernized institution, the First World War broke out. Likely to keep the peace with the West, Siam declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, and its role in the war would eventually earn its place in the Peace Conference of Versailles. This new level of relevance on the global stage
I didn't know they were also
protected
involved
Siam
in
from the
this.
potential risk that they faced in the past from Western colonization. As Siam now moved towards a constitutional monarchy and eventually became Thailand in 1939, the threat of any Western invasion was essentially non-existent. Due to a combination of geography, resistance, and assimilation, the Siamese proved to Britain, France, and any other colonial powers that it was best for everyone that they remain free and uncolonized. Thanks to the position of the French and British on either side and the policies under the later Siamese kings, Thailand managed to escape colonization.
Wow, really good video. So if you need to learn this for school or want to know it, then check out this video.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice day and see you in one of the next videos.